This slide is an introductory lesson on paradigms. How do we see things in the real world? Why we see things differently in the real world? And the real world is this complexity in which we live, and there are a lot of phenomena that exist in the real world that add to this complexity. And in this puzzling mix of complex phenomena that exist in the real world, there's hardly one singular way of looking and understanding these phenomena. Hence, this whole question of paradigms. So, if we take, for example, political system, which is a good political system and what is a bad political system? Is it communism or is it capitalism? There's hardly any yes or no answer to that question. But there are people who think that there is a unified way of looking or answering that question. To some people, they'll tell you absolutely the best system is capitalism. But there are people who tell you it is communism, and they stick with that argument. And they think that you can use mathematical models by sampling the opinions of people and coming up with answers that respond to that question. And according to these people, that answer is true and correct. People who think there is a single objective reality out there in nature are the people who will call positivists. Positivists think that there's a single objective reality out in the real world which can be unlocked through empirical observation, through mathematical models, through stating hypotheses that we can validate using these models. People who think like these are positivists. Positivism is great, it's a great paradigm to fall back onto if we are in the sciences like the mathematics and the physics and the chemistry, because if we say that the formula for water is two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen, H2O, if we use mathematical models, we can always unlock this reality. But if we are looking at society and dealing with all the complexities of society, we can hardly arrive at one singular objective truth about the way reality is. So positivism will be a paradigm that we can use or rely on a lot if we are looking at the physical sciences, chemistry, physics, mathematics, and maybe astronomy and some of these hard sciences. But if we are looking at society, positivism is not the paradigm we should be looking at. And that's why on the opposing end of positivism, we have constructivism, which agrees that there are multiple realities about the same phenomenon, or our context also modulates the way we see the real world. According to them, different people have different contexts which shapes their understanding of the world differently. So to some people who lived, for example, within a communist bloc and that system worked for them, they would think communism is the best system. But people who lived, let's say, within a capitalist society, they will think that is the best system of governance, and they will look at maybe communism as a negative, always negative, everything bad about it. So, depending on the context in which you find yourself, your own understanding of the real world or a phenomenon under investigation is going to be shaped differently. That's why constructivism as a paradigm agrees that there are several truths of the way we understand reality. They don't think there's a single objective reality. So what makes us to see the real world differently is our paradigm. And in this case, we have looked at two opposing paradigms that people often reference in social science research, which is positivism and constructivism. But there are other paradigms that we use as like critical realism, like pragmatism. But for now, let's stick with positivism and constructivism. Now, what makes paradigms to differ from each other, and what makes people to think differently when they observe a phenomenon? It is actually the dimensions of a paradigm that makes it differ from another. And ontology is one dimension. And ontological questions address how reality exists out there. And each paradigm thinks about the reality's existence out there differently. Some paradigm, like a paradigm like positivism, is thinking about a single objective reality that exists. So it's that ontology that makes it to differ from constructivism, which thinks that there are multiple realities. Another dimension that we view paradigms through, which makes one paradigm to differ from the other, is the epistemology. And what is the situation of the researcher when they're investigating the phenomenon in the real world is the question epistemology is trying to address. And That question is you have at the back of your mind is when the researcher is investigating a phenomenon in the real world, do their preconceived notions about that phenomenon and does their context influence their look on that reality out there? If your methodology is that you agree that a researcher ends up being influenced and the outcome of their research will be influenced by their own preconceived notions, then you are taking an epistemological stance of a constructivist. But if you think that the investigator and the investigated can be independent of each other, so that the investigator can observe the reality out in the real world without influencing on the outcome of that reality, then your epistemology is that of a positivist. And the last dimension is the methodology. So, which approach is the researcher then going to use to unlock that reality or understand that reality? Is it going to be based heavily on data collection and validating hypotheses and mathematical models? Or is the researcher going to rely heavily on qualitative approaches where they're going to sample the opinions of several people and also consider that each person's opinion about a phenomenon will lead to a different understanding depending on context of the same phenomenon that is being investigated? What methods as well is the investigator is going to use to collect data? All of these are methodological questions. So these three dimensions make one paradigm to differ from the other: ontology, epistemology, and methodology. Positivist ontology thinks that there's one single reality that exists. There's a single reality that exists out there in nature. And it's just up to us to use the right mathematical models to unlock that reality. And positivist epistemology believes that the investigator and the investigated are independent, and their methodology heavily relies on mathematical models and statistical analysis to validate hypotheses that are stated. Unlike the constructivist, whose ontology believes that there are multiple realities, reality has multiple forms, and the constructivists also think that the way reality presents itself to you can also modulate the way you see that reality. And in their epistemology, they assume and they understand that in analyzing a phenomenon, your own subjective position is always also going to influence the outcome of your understanding of that phenomenon. Even when you're writing your research or you're presenting your final thesis, your context is going to shape the way you understand the phenomenon you were studying. And the methodology for constructivism heavily relies on qualitative approaches, open-ended questions, interviews, qualitative approaches where the researcher gets really immersed into the phenomenon by observing, by talking to people. Sometimes they do participant observation, participate with the community, understand the phenomenon in order to document it. So these are the three different dimensions that make one paradigm to differ from another, and that is the reason that we see things differently. It's our paradigms that shapes our understanding, observations of phenomena in the real world. Which brings me to this closing statement, or define these final thoughts that several occurrences are seen differently through our prisms that are shaped by our background, context, sociocultural factors, and more. And generally, in the social science context, we see things the way we are and not the way they are. So, on this note, I hope you can differentiate between paradigms and you have understood so far why we see things differently in the real world. Thanks for listening.